Good morning, Michael. So nice to be here with you today,
Yes.
an ocean apart.
Yeah, an ocean apart, you in Paris, and I'm in somewhat overcast and gloomy Delaware today. Um,
Very green though, very green.
yes, it's green.
So yes, today I am here with my co-editor colleague Michael Clark, and we just thought it would be fun to do a little interview um, to between editors to get to know each other better, and also for anyone who's interested in the wheel to get to know us better. And so the upcoming issue with that's going to be on Orthodox identity kind of inspired me to choose Michael first because he wrote a piece for us back in spring of 22 about his experience in the Orthodox Church and the ways in which that formed his identity. So I thought it'd be interesting to come back to that in 2025 and ask him a few questions about that piece and see what's changed, what's remained the same. So I already mentioned that you wrote for us in spring of 22. And there were many individual contributors to this issue. It was called Out of It.
Mhm.
And people writing about their different experiences with the church, what had what brought them to stay, to leave,
Mhm.
and your story of how you ended up um, in the church was very interesting. So you'd opened it with a little sketch of your childhood memories
Right.
and childhood memories of church and the role it played in your family's life. And
Hmm.
your mother you describe as being a sort of cultural Episcopalian
Hmm.
who loved church music, but wasn't particularly interested in theology, theological questions, or the content of her faith
Hmm.
beyond kind of the social, cultural aspect. And I was wondering, looking back on those early days, and we'll talk about your father later. Um, is there anything that you miss about that sort of more immediate cultural proximity? You sang in the choir, um, yes, you were really in your own sort of dare I say, kind of waspy community, a very natural environment for you. And in the Orthodox Church, those of us who don't have a or ethnic Orthodox ancestry, but sometimes we struggle to, I don't know, find our niche. And so I was wondering if you ever look back on those times and what you make of that today.
Yes, it really is a part of when you come into the Orthodox world, of course, you find it's for someone from my background, it's suddenly very foreign. And my Episcopal Church upbringing, officially the first 25 years of my life. Um, and of course, the whole question of the convert experience, which is much bigger than we can handle today, is a part of this question. But the neither one of us really identifies with the uh, small t traditional ethnic cultural orthodoxy. But in my case, Liesl, if I'm not mistaken, you were only 10 years old when your entire family sort of moved into the Orthodox world. For
Not
me,
just my entire family, my entire church congregation.
your entire church moved en masse into Orthodoxy. That was not my experience at all. It was very much an individual, um, personal journey that began, back then. But of the things, your question about what do I miss? Um, just recently, it's come back to me as I've been visiting again in an Episcopal church, not really partaking, but um, it reminded me of the old things, some of which have changed, by the way, the things that I knew of the Episcopal Church in the 1960s have gone away. The old prayer book of 1928 and some of the cultural aspects. The music is still unchanged, and I certainly remember that, and it reminds me of those days when I had that very cultural connection to the church for me, which was that Episcopal Church connection, um, and largely through my mother, because my father had nothing to do with it. He played golf on Sunday mornings, as I mentioned in that the 2022 article, and my mother took me off to church. So his Enlightenment atheism really was also a part of my heritage, but didn't show up in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, interesting. So yes, that was actually my next question. So you describe in your article, you describe your parents as existing on sort of opposite poles almost of the rationality spectrum. That's probably not quite fair to your mother actually, but at least at least where it came to questions of religion, for her it was very much sentimental, aesthetic, um, cultural, and your father had this more rational approach, and his rational approach led him away from faith.
Hmm.
And you followed in your father's footsteps for a period.
Hmm.
And then it was while you were it was in your college years, if I understand correctly, that you met other Christians who were intellectual like you were, because you've always been an intellectual, classicist, a reader, a philosopher. And so you were introduced to this other kind of way of being Christian that was analytical and very stimulating. And so that was, I believe, in a Catholic context.
It ended up being in a Catholic context. It started out when I was at university. Most of my acquaintances were that sort of uh, was in a sort of an evangelical Protestant with a there was a component. I was very influenced by one friend of mine who was a big fan of the Inklings, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. So it was that aspect, that end of it. Of course, Tolkien was a Catholic and Lewis was an Anglican, but the intellectual side, this a sort of C.S. Lewis intellectual, was the biggest component of my thinking then. And when I came home, I would have these discussions with my atheist father, and he enjoyed the fact that I was no longer agreeing with him, and that bringing in this a new sort of. He loved nothing better than a verbal joust about whether it involved God or not, and of course I had stopped attending my mother's church at this time, and so I was on this journey in exploring what I at that time wanted to become the most genuine expression of Christian faith. And
Yeah.
I had decided I hadn't quite found it yet. And then when I was 25 and I was in graduate school, I was actually studying theology. I made the decision to join the Catholic Church. And that was when I was 25 years old, in the late 70s. It was actually November 1st, 1980, when I formally became a member of the Catholic Church. Very much an intellect as a result of an intellectual pursuit.
Yes, that's what's really interesting is you describe how for you when you encountered this more intellectual religion, more intellectual religious experience, it felt like something that could resolve these sort of two sides of your childhood, the that more sort of emotional or aesthetically oriented vision of your mother with the rational side of your father, and in something like the Catholic Mass, you have these elements that come
Mhm.
together, and it felt perhaps like you would be able to resolve
Right. And
contradictions through
it's
the
funny.
marrying of these elements. Where are
Yes.
you with that today?
My father's thing, he admired the Jesuits, for example, even though when I came into the Catholic Church, it wasn't in a Jesuit context at all, but that sort of hard-nosed intellectual
Yeah.
understanding of Christianity that was typical of the Jesuits. Um, so my father would, uh, I dragged him to towards the end of my college years, I took him to or graduate school years, to a Christmas mass at the cathedral in Washington, the Catholic Cathedral, St. Matthew's. And he just sort of poo-pooed it and rolled his eyes, but he recognized that I was on my own path and it was worthy of, we could argue about it um, at home. And so that was the way that I had sort of pulled it together. My mother's aesthetic for Christianity and my father's rational, even though I rejected the basis of his rationality, it was all part of it. And the experience that I had um, with the Orthodox Church began in my Catholic years. Had gone back to uh, I never finished a theology degree that I had been doing. And I went back to get a degree in French, which then became my career in education. I was a classics undergraduate major. I then went to complete a master's degree in French by living in Paris for a year. That was 1983 to 1984. And so I was a brand new Catholic at that point and was still sort of deciding where was it I fit into this world, the Catholic world, which was also new to me. Um, I've sort of spent my life getting into a context that wasn't particularly comfortable, that was sort of outside what I had experienced before. And I remember um, the two very important influences that have stuck with me when I was studying in Paris. First of all, the experience of um, another really hard intellectual understanding of Christianity was the subject of my mémoire, my master's thesis, which was the mystical thinking of Simon Weil, a philosopher, religious thinker of the 1930s and 40s. Um, and at the same time, I was wandering along the Seine, and at one of the bouquinistes, the booksellers there along the Seine, I saw a copy of La théologie mystique de l'Église d'Orient for English speakers out there, the mystical theology of the Eastern Church by Vladimir Lossky. And this, when I read this as
The Buckinist stand.
at a bouquiniste stand, just
Okay.
sort of just out there, and I took it home and read it and said, "Wow, this is theology. Wait a minute, he's Orthodox. He's not a Catholic." And so that sort of began my exploration of the Orthodox world when I was going to remain a Catholic for another 20 years.
Mhm.
Um, and again, that was just sort of an extension of my intellectual understanding that Losky's, um, now his idea was very different from a rational, either the approach of C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, but his the rigor of his thinking and how he described the Orthodox Church was still very much a part of my intellectual identity. Um,
Interesting,
and
because you do talk about how at some point Catholicism, it's just started to feel sort of overly rational, overly institutional, um,
yes,
perhaps a bit self-regarding, self-protective. And
right.
so and so Losky was sort of a new door to open into.
Yes, and the title of his primal work there, maybe his most important work, was the mystical theology, which he said was an essential part of the Orthodox understanding, that it's not merely an intellectual pursuit, um, but our understanding is so limited. The very first chapter is about the apophatic, that is the negative on the incredible limits that we have even thinking about the nature of God. And so that became a starting off point as I moved away from the sort of institutional cold, um, sort of focused on moral um, control rather than mystical experience of who God is and what the church means. And so that was the start of that evolution.
So that's a great segue into the question, my next question, which is sort of how you see that mysticism that you discovered through Losky, the sort of, I don't know, intellectual mysticism or ancient mysticism with um their with this sort of new trend of converts that we're seeing maybe over the past, I don't know, maybe it's since COVID. I don't really know when it's begun, but if you go into the orthosphere, there's a lot of people coming to Orthodoxy for the mystical aspect, and not so much the theological. I mean, that's there as well, I suppose. But you know but not just mystical, but almost magical.
Mhm.
And the parts of Orthodoxy that are very grounded in kind of folk religion, folk culture is very appealing to the sort of contemporary convert. And how is how do you feel the sort of, I don't know, tension between well, I'm going to call it the new mysticism with the more old school mysticism um, that you speak of?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I'm not sure that anyone has sorted it out, yeah, yet. The um, there's a lot of talk in this sort of experts in public religion, and I'm thinking of, you know, people who
Yeah.
are not really theologians, but are um,
Right. There was this Ross Dovitt
Ross
interview
Duffett,
with,
who's actually a journalist for the New York Times, and of course the vice president J.D. Vance,
yes,
convert to Catholicism, not Orthodoxy. Both of those are Catholics, but we also have Rod Dreher, who's a convert to Orthodoxy from Catholicism, ought to be a lot like me in terms of our background, but we have very different approaches, to say the least. And so a lot of those people are sort of public experts on religious thought, I'll call them that, have emphasized this return to sort of a re-enchantment of the
yes.
world and religious experience in the sense of having visions and um, that sort of and sort
Yeah,
of
an almost post-rational,
yes,
that brings us back in time, or
right.
a post-rationality that is actually dis discovered to be a pre-rationality or something.
Yes, yeah, and that is not particularly in line with my trajectory. As there's a sense in which, as I came into the Orthodox Church through this intellectual side, this theological, a theological Orthodox identity is what I have. Um, Once in the church, I saw in the liturgy, especially, and in uh, the living experience in the church that um, there were some things that had always been missing in my experience, either pre-Catholic or Catholic, um, that the Orthodox Church had, and I would put it, I was had become not just a theological Orthodox Christian, but also a liturgical one. And that is not the same thing as coming into the Orthodox Church and wanting to um, run out after, myrrh streaming icons and the that sort of folk level of miraculous religious experience. I saw the validity of my religious experience um, in a liturgical context, not just uh, a sort of individual, personal um, kind of religion. But I had really become sold on a corporate and communal religion, which had sort of been missing to me. Should have been part of a Catholic experience, but wasn't. And so that changed.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, at the end of your essay,
Mm.
you expressed your dismay at the statements of Patriarch Kirill, um, and how he kind of, weaponized the decadent West. Um, and all of this is part of his pro-war propaganda. Um, and statements really that exceed the excesses of any pope at least in recent history. um that perhaps, I guess where I'm going with this is the idea that where it seemed at one time that the Orthodox Church kind of existed in the sort of in a mind yourself background.
Mm.
Today, our hierarchy has really come to the foreground of these culture wars, and you know is weaponizing people like me and you to instill fear and fight wars. And so what where does that leave you today? And how do you think about the sort of East-West divide in the modern context? We now have an American Pope. Um, I don't know, I feel like the global stage has changed a lot since the time you became Orthodox.
It has, and the global stage has really changed a lot since I moved from my father's point of view to a Christian point of view in the 60s and 70s, where religion played a very different role, I think. And this revival and Patriarch Kirill is just, I think, the cutting edge of the very worst aspect of it. Um, the idea that religion has a role to play in what I'll call crowd control. I think I referred to that phrase even, that um, because the Patriarch of Moscow seems to see the Russian context as a cultural battle, and that this is what you talk about weaponizing. We have it's my idea was that the new moving forward, I think Christianity actually must go in the opposite direction. It became a this prominent feature of civil society, and returning to in a Catholic context, it would be returning to a sort of medieval understanding of the supremacy of the Pope, or in the case of uh, Kirill's understanding, the supremacy of the state in Putin's Russia, which is so inimical to my understanding of either an intellectual revival of Christian faith among people who didn't believe, or a revival of mystical experience in the church, not the reimposition of Christendom. There was I don't believe I mentioned her in that particular article, but there was a French Catholic writer who talked about um, the new role of the church is as a sort of invisible um, witness a to the future of Christian faith. And another writer that I very much admire, um, uh, David Bentley Hart, has spoken of the role of Christianity in the modern world can't just be focused on the power structures of the past at all, but has to be focused as well on the future of Christian faith, um, which is going to be in a realm, almost an apocalyptic realm, where uh, we can't just be thinking of Christ is both Alpha and Omega. We're very good at Alpha, where we came from, what's the past, but we also have to be thinking of Omega. What's where is Christ taking us into a um, non-temporal, not non-cultural, non-political future? And so those are the sorts of things that sort of occupy my mind and very inimical to the vision of Patriarch Kirill is perhaps the worst example. He sees it completely in his own cultural context, but in many of the sort of the new Christians, the new Orthodox or new Catholics as well, who want to reintroduce um, a notion of Christian hegemony, Christian domination of culture and politics. Whereas, quite frankly, I think that it's going to be a requirement that um, Christianity itself become a silent um, critic through the conscience of Christians of in the entire cultural context. And so that's a very different perspective.
It is, it really is. Well, that was great, Michael. Thanks so much for talking with me today. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add or
Oh,
um
the only thing that you actually mentioned, I thought I should put it out there. The new Pope, um, the new American Pope, who happens to be almost exactly my age. We're
oh,
only six
I forgot about that. Yes, thank you for coming
we're
back to
we're
that.
only 6 days apart. He's 6 days younger than me. This is the first time in my life that I'm older than the Pope, even if it's only by 6 days. Um, and it's brought me back to sort of re-examining the 22 years I spent as an active member in the Catholic Church, and exactly what that's meant, and the meaning of that for the Orthodox world. I think he's already begun outreach in the Orthodox world, and I'm interested to see what sort of a unifying figure. Obviously, the Pope has always, in a sense, my sort of silent witness approach to Christianity is not necessarily going to be that of the Pope, but exactly how he's going to present a public face for Christian faith is going to be interesting as we watch the development there.
Yes, absolutely. We're all hoping for greater unity and
Yes.
fraternity amongst Christians.
And that he speaks with an American accent just makes it more interesting for us who are
Oh, yeah.
used to circulating in circles where most people have an accent not at all like our own, whether it's Russian or Greek or some other ethnic, classically historical ethnic Orthodox cultural context.
Oh yes, when he addressed the public in Italian on the day he was elected, was I was so surprised, at least as far as my ear is tuned. I couldn't really find any trace of an American accent in his Italian.
And
Uh,
no, and his Spanish is flawless because he spent all that time in Peru, and so the uh, multicultural aspect of who he is a person. You know, an American who speaks when he has spoken English just sounds like someone from Chicago, which is what he is. Um, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and how it plays out in the ecumenical relations between the Roman Catholic Church and Orthodoxy. So we'll have
so,
to see.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Michael, and have a great day.
Okay.
I'll see you again soon at our next editorial meeting.
Meeting. Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Liesl.